Keanu Reeves had always been known for his kindness, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment his past and present collided in the most unexpected way. It was a crisp evening in Los Angeles, the city lights buzzing with an energy that never quite faded. Keanu had just finished dinner with a close friend when he decided to take a quiet drive through the city. The streets, though familiar, had a way of feeling different at night. Shadows stretched longer, faces blurred into anonymity. He was lost in thought when his eyes caught something, or rather someone, that made his heart slam against his chest. There, beneath the dim glow of a street lamp near Sunset Boulevard, was a woman curled up under a tattered blanket. She looked frail, her thin shoulders trembling as she pulled the fabric tighter around her body. Her once dark hair was now streaked with silver, her hands rough from the cold. Keanu had passed hundreds of people in similar situations before, but something about her made him stop. His breath hitched. No, it couldn't be. He stepped closer, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Maria?" he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the distant hum of traffic. The woman stirred, her weary eyes fluttering open. There was a moment of hesitation, a brief flicker of recognition before her gaze fully locked onto his. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Then, in a voice so fragile it almost broke him, she whispered, "Mr. Reeves?" His heart clenched. It was her, Maria Thompson. Memories flooded his mind like a tidal wave. Maria, his former housekeeper, his friend, his silent guardian during the hardest moments of his life. She had been there when grief threatened to consume him, leaving handwritten notes on his counter to remind him to eat. She had been the one to quietly place a warm cup of tea in his hands after long, grueling nights of filming. She had been family, and now she was here, broken, homeless, and alone. Keanu crouched down, his voice thick with emotion. "Maria, what happened to you?" She turned her face away, shame evident in her hunched shoulders. "Life happened," she murmured. He wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but he knew better. He knew what it meant to carry burdens too heavy to share, so instead, he extended his hand. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you out of here." Maria hesitated. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over his, but then, just as quickly, she pulled back. "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't belong in your world anymore." Keanu felt something inside him twist. Not belong? This was the same woman who had made his house feel like a home. The same woman who had cared for him like a son, and now she thought she was unworthy of help? His jaw tightened. "You took care of me when I needed it most. Let me do the same for you." Maria exhaled shakily. "I lost everything, Keanu. After my husband died, the medical bills drained every cent. I sold the house, the car. I tried to start over, but I was already too old for anyone to care." She let out a bitter laugh. "You don't get second chances when you're past a certain age. The streets, they change you." Keanu swallowed hard. He had seen suffering before, felt it, lived it, but this was personal. "Then let's change things back," he said softly. She met his gaze, searching his face as if trying to decide if he was real or just another cruel trick of her mind, and then, after a long, agonizing silence, she broke. Tears slipped down her weathered cheeks, and she covered her face with shaking hands. Keanu didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as she sobbed. He didn't care about the stares of passers-by, didn't care about the murmurs of people watching. He only cared about Maria. When the worst of her sobs had subsided, he murmured, "You're coming with me." This time she didn't argue. This time she let him take her hand, and as they walked toward his car, Keanu made a silent promise. Maria would never be alone again. Keanu led Maria toward his car, his grip firm yet gentle, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. The weight of her frail hand in his sent a fresh wave of determination through him. This wasn't just about helping an old friend. This was about giving her back something she had long forgotten. Dignity, belonging, a chance at life again. The streets of Los Angeles stretched before them, indifferent to the moment unfolding. As they neared the car, Maria hesitated, her feet shuffling against the pavement. Keanu turned, sensing her reluctance. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. Maria swallowed hard. I don't want to dirty your car. Keanu felt his chest tighten. The shame in her voice was unbearable. He opened the passenger door and gestured inside. Maria, don't say that. You're not dirt. You're my friend. Her lip quivered as she exhaled sharply, nodding as she slowly slid into the seat. He shut the door carefully before walking around to the driver's side. Once inside, he started the engine, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. She was gripping the seatbelt tightly, as if bracing herself. You hungry? He asked, easing the car onto the road. Maria hesitated before nodding. I haven't had a proper meal in a while. Keanu clenched the steering wheel. We'll fix that. As they drove through the city, Maria stared out the window, her fingers still twitching against the fabric of her coat. Keanu noticed. Are you warm enough? She nodded, but didn't meet his gaze. I've had worse nights. That wasn't good enough for him. He reached into the back seat, pulling forward a spare hoodie he had tossed there earlier. Without a word, he draped it over her lap. Maria flinched at first, but then slowly picked it up, running her fingers over the soft fabric. She stopped, her voice catching. No need to thank me, Keanu said gently. They pulled into a small diner, one of those 24-hour joints where the coffee was always fresh and the waitresses knew the regulars by name. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and it was safe. Maria hesitated at the entrance. Keanu reached for her hand again, his voice firm yet kind. You deserve to be here, Maria. She nodded, exhaling shakily, and followed him inside. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. A few late-night diners glanced their way, but most quickly returned to their meals. A waitress approached them, her eyes flickering over Maria's worn clothes before settling on Keanu's familiar face. Table for two? She asked. Keanu nodded. Somewhere quiet, if possible. The waitress led them to a booth near the back. Maria slid in cautiously, her hands folded in her lap. Keanu picked up the menu and handed it to her. Order whatever you want. She took it hesitantly, her fingers shaking slightly. Her eyes scanned the pages, but it was clear she wasn't just overwhelmed by the options, she was unaccustomed to the choice. After a long pause, she murmured, Maybe just soup. I don't want to waste anything. Keanu closed his own menu. You're not wasting anything. Order what you'd really like. Maria swallowed hard. A sandwich, maybe? He smiled. Good choice. When the waitress returned, Keanu ordered for both of them, making sure Maria's meal came with extra sides. As they waited, he leaned back, watching her. Do you remember when you used to make me those little handwritten meal plans? He asked, grinning slightly. Maria let out a small chuckle, the first real sound of warmth he had heard from her all night. You always forgot to eat on set. Someone had to keep you alive. He chuckled. You're right, and I never told you how much I appreciated that. Her smile faded slightly. I miss those days. Keanu leaned forward. So did I. Their food arrived, and Maria hesitated for only a moment before picking up her sandwich. As soon as she took the first bite, her shoulders sagged in relief. The warmth, the familiarity of a proper meal, it was something she had long been deprived of. Keanu pretended not to notice the way she held back tears between bites. He simply let her eat in peace. After they finished, he paid the bill and led her back outside. The city air was crisp, and Maria shivered slightly. Without a word, Keanu slipped off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, her lips parted in protest, but he shook his head. Don't argue. It's yours now. She exhaled, clutching it tighter around herself. Thank you. The drive to his house was quiet. Maria seemed lost in thought, her fingers absently tracing the edge of his jacket sleeve. When they finally pulled into his driveway, she stiffened again. The house was large but welcoming, the soft glow of the porch light illuminating the familiar architecture. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. Keanu turned off the engine and faced her. Maria, you don't have to be afraid. She let out a breath. It's not fear, it's guilt. I disappeared. I should have called. I should have stopped. His voice was gentle but firm. You don't owe me an apology. I'm just glad I found you. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I don't want to be a burden. Keanu smiled softly. You never were, and you never will be. A long silence stretched between them before Maria finally nodded. When they stepped inside, the warmth of the house enveloped her. Everything was as she remembered. The scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air, the bookshelves lined with stories she used to dust every week. Maria stood in the doorway, hesitant, her fingers tightening around the edges of Keanu's jacket. Keanu glanced at her, then motioned toward the living room. "Sit down, rest." She obeyed slowly, sinking into the couch. The plush cushions must have felt foreign after so many years of sleeping on the streets. Keanu disappeared for a moment, then returned with something small in his hands. Maria gasped softly as he placed it on the coffee table in front of her. It was her notebook, the one she had left behind years ago, filled with handwritten recipes, reminders, and the little notes she used to leave for him. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, flipping through the familiar pages. "You kept this?" she whispered. Keanu nodded. "Of course I did." Maria swallowed hard, pressing the notebook to her chest as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. For so long, she had convinced herself that she had been forgotten, that the world had moved on without her. But sitting here in this house, surrounded by pieces of her past that Keanu had held onto, she realized something. She had never been forgotten. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she thought. Maria sat in the warmth of Keanu's home, her fingers still wrapped around the edges of the notebook. The weight of it in her hands was grounding, a tangible reminder of a life that once was. The clock on the wall ticked softly, filling the silence that stretched between them. Keanu watched her carefully, understanding that this wasn't just about giving her a place to stay, it was about rebuilding something long lost. She finally set the notebook down, her eyes flickering toward the fireplace that crackled gently in the corner. "I didn't think I'd ever feel warmth like this again," she admitted, almost to herself. Keanu leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "You don't have to live in the cold anymore, Maria. Not just physically, but in your heart too." Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment Keanu thought she might argue, tell him that some wounds never heal. But instead, she let out a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. The sound of rain started to patter softly against the windows. Maria tilted her head, listening. "It used to rain the day after you finished a film," she mused. "Every time. I used to joke that the universe was giving you a day to rest." Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe it still is." A comfortable silence followed before he stood up. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the hallway. "Let's get you settled." Maria hesitated but followed him as he led her down the hall. He stopped in front of a familiar door, turning the handle slowly. The room inside was cozy, with a bed covered in a soft quilt, a small wooden dresser, and a lamp that cast a warm glow. Her breath hitched as she stepped inside. "I remember this room," she whispered, running her fingers along the edge of the dresser. "This was where I used to stay when I worked late." Keanu nodded. "I never changed it. I guess some part of me hoped you'd come back one day." Maria turned to him, her throat tight with emotion. "I never thought I'd have a place to come back to." He met her gaze. "You always did." She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap. Keanu moved to the doorway, sensing she needed a moment. "Get some rest, Maria. We'll talk in the morning." She nodded, and for the first time in years, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Maria awoke before the sun, the stillness of the house unfamiliar. For years, she had been conditioned to wake with the sounds of the streets, cars honking, voices murmuring, the shuffle of footsteps on pavement. The absence of that chaos left her feeling untethered. She sat up slowly, her body sore from years of sleeping on the ground. When she stood, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror above the dresser. The woman staring back at her was one she barely recognized. Her face hollowed, lines deepened by hardship, her hair thinner than it had been. She sighed and turned away. The house was quiet as she stepped out into the hallway. She didn't want to wake Keanu, but her feet carried her toward the kitchen. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, and instinct took over. She reached for a pan, running her fingers over the handle. It had been so long since she had cooked in a real kitchen. The muscles in her hands remembered the motions, even if she felt like a stranger in this space. Maria moved carefully, reaching for eggs, butter, and a loaf of bread. Soon, the sound of sizzling filled the air, the rich aroma of French toast curling into the corners of the house. She was so lost in the familiar rhythm of cooking that she didn't hear Keanu enter the kitchen. "You're up early," he said softly. She turned, startled, a spatula still in her hand. I thought I could make breakfast," she admitted, unsure if she had overstepped. Keanu smiled, his eyes warm. "I've missed your cooking." Maria let out a small breath of relief and turned back to the stove. "I wasn't sure if I'd remember how." "Well," he said, stepping closer, "judging by the smell, I'd say you remember just fine." She flipped the last piece of toast onto a plate and set it on the counter. Keanu reached for the syrup and poured some over his serving, taking a bite. His eyes closed for a moment before he nodded. "Tastes like home." Maria's fingers curled around the edge of the counter. That word, home, felt both foreign and familiar. She sat across from him, hesitantly picking at her food. Keanu watched her carefully. "Maria, what do you want to do next?" She looked up. "Next?" He nodded. "I don't want to pressure you, but I want to help you figure out what you want for yourself." She stared down at her plate, deep in thought. "I used to love taking care of people," she murmured. "Not just you, but my husband, my friends. After I lost everything, I thought that part of me was gone." Keanu set his fork down. "It's not gone, Maria. It's still there, and you can still help people." She swallowed hard. "But how? Who would want someone like me?" Keanu leaned forward. "You know, there are shelters, programs for people trying to get back on their feet. You have something no one else does. You understand. You know what it's like to be out there. You could help others in ways no one else can." Maria blinked, the idea sinking in. "You think I could do that?" "I know you can," he said with certainty. A long pause stretched between them before she whispered, "I'd like that." Keanu grinned. "Then that's what we'll do." For the first time, Maria felt something she hadn't in a long time: purpose. That afternoon, Keanu made a few calls. Maria sat on the couch, listening as he spoke to someone about volunteer work at a nearby women's shelter. When he hung up, he turned to her. "They'd love to meet you," he said. "No pressure. You can just go and see how it feels." Maria nodded, nerves fluttering in her stomach. The shelter was a small building tucked into a quiet neighborhood. When they arrived, Maria hesitated at the door. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this." She exhaled and stepped inside. The shelter director, a kind woman named Elise, greeted them warmly. "Maria, Keanu told me a bit about you. We could really use someone like you here." Maria glanced around the room, her eyes landing on a woman in the corner, her clothes worn, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Their eyes met for a brief second, and Maria saw herself in that woman's weary expression. Something inside her clicked. "I'd like to help," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Elise smiled. "Then let's get started." Keanu watched as Maria took her first steps towards something new, something that mattered. As they drove home later that evening, Maria stared out the window, a small but genuine smile on her lips. "You were right," she said softly. "I can still help people." Keanu glanced at her, pride swelling in his chest. "I'd never doubted it." For the first time in years, Maria wasn't just surviving, she was living. Over the next few days, Maria slowly adjusted to the idea that she had a place to call home again. It still felt unreal, waking up in a warm bed instead of the cold pavement. The silence was unnerving at times. No cars speeding by, no distant murmurs of strangers in the night, no fear of waking up to find someone had taken the little she had. At first, she moved cautiously, afraid that at any moment this dream would shatter and she'd find herself back under that street lamp on Sunset Boulevard. But each morning, the house remained solid and Keanu remained there, patient and kind, never making her feel like a burden. One morning, as she was folding the soft blanket from her bed, she noticed a neatly stacked pile of clothes on the chair by the window. A small note was placed on top in Keanu's familiar handwriting. "Thought these might fit. If not, we can go shopping together." Maria traced the letters with her fingertips, a lump forming in her throat. She had spent so long feeling invisible that even this small gesture made her feel seen again. She hesitated, then picked up one of the sweaters, a deep navy blue, thick and warm. She pulled it over her head, the fabric soft against her skin. It was a perfect fit. When she stepped out into the hallway, she found Keanu in the kitchen, sipping his morning coffee. He looked up, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Looks good on you," he said simply. Maria nodded, tugging at the sleeves. "It's been a while since I've worn something this nice." Keanu gestured toward the table. "Come sit, I made some tea." She sat down, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Keanu finally spoke. "How do you feel about today?" Maria knew what he meant, the shelter, her first real step toward regaining a sense of purpose. She had spent years believing she had nothing left to offer the world, but now she was being given a chance to prove herself wrong. She exhaled, nervous. "But ready?" Keanu nodded. "That's all that matters." Later that afternoon, Maria stood outside the women's shelter, staring up at the small but welcoming building. She had always thought she'd never belong anywhere again, but looking at the place now, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this was exactly where she needed to be. When she stepped inside, Elise greeted her warmly. "Maria, so glad you could make it." Maria offered a small, tentative smile. I wasn't sure if I'd be any help." Elise waved off her doubt. "You'd be surprised how much experience you already have. Come on, let's get you started." She led Maria to a communal area where a few women sat on worn-out couches, some chatting in hushed voices, others staring into the distance, lost in thought. One woman, barely in her 40s, sat by herself, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Maria recognized that posture instantly. Defensive, weary, ready to run at the first sign of trouble. Elise must have noticed Maria's gaze. "Her name's Tanya. She's been here a few weeks but doesn't talk much. Maybe she'll open up to you." Maria hesitated before making her way over. She sat down on the opposite end of the couch, leaving enough space so the woman wouldn't feel cornered. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then finally, Maria broke the silence. "You remind me of myself," she admitted softly. Tanya's eyes flickered toward her, wary but curious. Maria continued, keeping her voice gentle. "I was out there for years. Thought I'd never find a way back." She hesitated. "But someone saw me. Someone reminded me that I wasn't invisible." Tanya let out a quiet scoff. "People don't help unless they want something in return." Maria swallowed the lump in her throat. She knew that feeling. The bitterness, the exhaustion. "You're right," she said. "Most people look the other way, but not everyone." Tanya studied her for a long moment before looking down at her hands. "So what, you're here to fix me?" Maria shook her head. "No, I'm just here to listen." A beat of silence passed, then another. And then, barely above a whisper, Tanya murmured, "I used to be a nurse." Maria's chest tightened. "Used to be?" She nodded. "I used to be someone else too." For the first time, Tanya met her gaze, and in that moment, Maria knew this was where she was meant to be. That night, when she returned home, Keanu was waiting in the living room, a book resting on his lap. He glanced up as she walked in, noting the exhaustion on her face, but also something else. "How'd it go?" he asked. Maria sat down across from him, exhaling as she kicked off her shoes. "Hard, but good," he smiled. "That's the best kind of work." She leaned back against the couch, closing her eyes for a moment. "I met a woman today, Tanya. She reminded me of myself. I think I can actually do something there, Keanu. Something real." Keanu's voice was warm. "I never doubted that." Maria opened her eyes, looking at him. "I don't know how to thank you for this." "You don't have to," he said simply. "Just promise me one thing." She tilted her head. "What?" "Don't disappear again." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "I won't." And for the first time, she truly believed it. Over the next few weeks, Maria found herself settling into a new rhythm. She spent her mornings at the shelter, talking to women who had been through the same struggle she had. Some days were hard. There were moments when the stories she heard cut too deep, when she saw too much of herself in the people she was trying to help. But every time she felt overwhelmed, she reminded herself of one simple truth. She had survived, and if she had made it through, maybe she could help someone else do the same. Keanu continued to check in on her, though he never hovered. He seemed to know when to offer support and when to step back, giving her space to figure things out on her own. One evening, after a long day at the shelter, Maria sat with Keanu on the back porch, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. The air was cool, a soft breeze rustling the trees. She turned to him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Do you ever think about second chances?" Keanu took a slow sip of his tea before answering. "All the time," Maria nodded. "I used to think they didn't exist, that once you lost everything, there was no going back." Keanu set his cup down. "And now?" She glanced up at the sky, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Now I think maybe life isn't about going back, maybe it's about moving forward, finding something new." Keanu studied her for a moment before nodding. "I think you're right." A comfortable silence settled between them. The stars were beginning to emerge, twinkling softly against the darkening sky. Maria exhaled, feeling the weight of the past finally beginning to lift. She wasn't the same woman she had been all those years ago, but maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. And as she sat there, side by side with the man who had given her back her life, she realized something profound. She had spent so many years believing she had no place in the world, but now she knew. She belonged. The days stretched into weeks, and with each passing moment, Maria found herself slowly shedding the weight of her past. The walls she had built around herself, forged from years of hardship and isolation, were beginning to crack. Not because she had forced them to, but because, for the first time in a long time, she wanted them to. One evening, after finishing her shift at the shelter, Maria walked through the quiet streets, feeling the hum of the city around her. The air smelled of rain, though the skies were still clear. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and let herself breathe in the life she was slowly rebuilding. As she turned the corner near a row of small cafes, her eyes landed on a bookstore. The warm glow from inside spilled onto the sidewalk, and through the large windows, she saw shelves lined with books, cozy reading nooks tucked into corners, and a handful of people quietly flipping through pages. Something about the scene pulled her forward. She stepped inside, the faint scent of old pages and freshly brewed coffee wrapping around her like a memory. The last time she had been in a bookstore, she had been an entirely different person. Before she had lost her home, before life had unraveled around her. She wandered the aisles, running her fingers along the spines of novels, cookbooks, memoirs. Each book held a story, a life waiting to be discovered. "Can I help you find something?" a soft voice asked. Maria turned to see a woman, probably in her 60s, wearing a knitted cardigan and glasses perched on the tip of her nose. I'm just looking," Maria admitted. The woman smiled. "Take your time. Books have a way of finding the right people." Maria nodded, her fingers lingering over a hardcover book about home-cooked meals. It reminded her of the notebook Keanu had kept for all those years, the one filled with recipes she had once written for him. She hesitated before pulling it from the shelf. Later that evening, she sat in Keanu's kitchen, the book resting open in front of her. She traced the words on the page, recipes that spoke of comfort, warmth, things she had once lost but was beginning to find again. Keanu walked in, pausing when he saw her. "Reading up on new dishes?" Maria smiled faintly. "I used to love cooking, not just for work, but because it made me feel like I was giving people something real, something that mattered." Keanu leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Then maybe it's time you start again." She met his gaze, thoughtful. "I think I'd like that." Over the next few days, Maria slowly reacquainted herself with the kitchen. She started small, a simple soup, a loaf of bread, but as she regained confidence, the meals became more elaborate. One evening, she surprised Keanu with a dinner he hadn't had in years, one of the dishes she used to make for him after long filming days. The moment he took his first bite, he closed his eyes, a smile tugging at his lips. This tastes like a memory. Maria laughed, a genuine, full sound that filled the room. I suppose it is. That night, as she washed the dishes, she realized something. Cooking had always been her way of caring for people, of showing love without words. And now, after so many years of losing herself, she was finally finding her way back. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. Enjoyed this story? Watch the next video for another great one, and be sure to subscribe for more exciting tales.